Since I started dungeon mastering last year, there's a few things I've noticed that has been a little bit challenging for me. Like sometimes I forget to give out inspiration, and sometimes I'm worried if I'm not giving inspiration out to enough of my players and spreading them out equally. All players love critical successes and rolling those natural 20s, but when it comes to critical failures, sometimes people want to see an additional thing happen, not just automatically missing. Some players don't like that, so I'm trying to figure out a good way to balance that. I also try find ways to allow players to role play and add to the story narratively as well too. So here are some changes I made in my game to kind of address those things. Welcome to Crit Hit the Giant, and this is your first time coming to this channel. This is where I share my journey of going into the world of tabletop role-playing games with you all. And as I mentioned before, I started this journey 2 years ago. And last year, I started my journey in becoming a dungeon and game master, mostly out of a necessity because I have some friends who have always wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons, but they never had like access to someone who could run a game for them. I also became a dungeon master for my kids, so that way they could start playing the weekly game with some other kids at our gaming store. And even though I didn't think I would want to be a dungeon master or game master for at least a few more years, I started last year and I've been enjoying it a lot. So here are a few things that I have created to incorporate into my own games to address some needs that I've noticed in my games. But before we get into that, there's a couple pieces of news that I want to share with you all. Our first piece of news comes from the creators of Dragonbane Free League Publishing. They release a new quick start guide, The Sinking Tower, completely free on Drive-Thru RPG. And I'll put a link in the description below if you're interested in that. But this is a great way to get into Dragonbane either as a player or as a game master. It includes a lot of different kinds of encounters and activities. It is a 2 hours long adventure, so it's designed to be a one-shot. Even if you're not interested in the game of Dragonbane, this might be a great resource of inspiration for you if you're looking for new things to include in some of your other tabletop role-playing games. So I encourage you to check it out at least. Next up comes from the world of Dungeons & Dragons. Wizards of the Coast announced that they're adding 2 more books to their publications this year. One called Eberron, Forge of the Artificer, which will include the popular class Artificer that was not included in the Player's Handbook for 2024. So a lot of people are going to be happy about that. And then the second book they announced did not have a title or description, so we don't know much about that one yet. But all the other books that they announced earlier, like the Forgotten Realms series books, the Dragon Anthology, which is now called Dragon Delve, and the starter kit, Heroes of the Borderland, they have announced more details about each of those books and starter kit, as well as the release date. So if you're interested in reading more about this from the Ian World blog post, an article that I have up here on the screen, I will put a link to that in the description below. Okay, so let's dive into today's topic for this video, and that is the 3 things I've added to my games that I want to share with you all, and maybe this might inspire you to either take this and run this with your own games, or maybe adapt it for your own games, or maybe you have questions about it or concerns about what I have in here that I'd be more happy to talk with you all and discuss this, and maybe you've caught something that I didn't even think about when using these rules I'm adding here. So we're first going to start up with this idea called Pool of Heroic Inspiration. Now, to be transparent, this is not a unique idea for me. This is actually something that I took from when I played at a table at D&D in the Castle over the summer back in August. And so I really like the idea so much I wanted to include it in my games. And this is a variation of this. So this is not exactly how we use this in our game. And from my understanding, other people have used some sort of variation with this as well too. So Pool of Heroic Inspiration is based on the 2024 rules. But the idea here is that players can actually do something a little bit more creatively in their games, that they can add a token to this pool that is open to anyone in the group. So it's not necessarily just that person who added the token gets to use it, but they can actually offer that for anybody in the party to use inspiration. So this alleviates the need to have to give it out to people based on, role play or other strings that you might be concerned if you're giving it out to enough people or balancing out to enough people, but it allows them to kind of play collaboratively and work together as a team to be able to do something to give other players on the team an additional resource that might be helpful for them. So the idea here is that there are things that would be tied to this that they can earn a chance to add a token to the pool of heroic inspiration, right? So the examples I have here is heroic failure and leveling up narrative, and those are the two things I'm going to explain later in the video on how those things work. But the conditions I have when I run heroic inspiration, pool of heroic inspiration, is that the same rules that apply to heroic inspiration also applies to pool of heroic inspiration as well too. And that is, how the dice rolls are used. So basically the main thing with this is that if the rule about heroic inspiration is if you roll with advantage, you don't get to use a heroic inspiration and re-roll both the dice of advantage. You just pick one die that you're going to re-roll, right? And so those are still the same rules that goes into play with the pool of heroic inspiration. The other thing is when a player gets to add a token to the pool, they can't use it immediately during their turn. The idea is to prevent them from adding that token and then immediately using that to try to re-roll the scenario that they use to gain that token as well too. So it's kind of a way to keep that honor in there, and that it guarantees this is something that is not being abused, essentially. The way I run this, and you can change this for your own game, is that I still allow players to have their own individual heroic inspiration. So I still give that out when I remember from time to time. If you're playing a human, you automatically get heroic inspiration every day after a long rest. So I don't want to take that away from the players. But if you want to use this instead of heroic inspiration, that's something you could do. But I put a cap on how big the pool can be. And maybe you might want to change the number to this, or maybe you want to increase it or decrease it. But the way I set the parameters around it is that they can only have no more than one less that's in their party. So if they have a party of 5, then the pool can only be as large as 4 tokens at one time. That encourages them to use those tokens of heroic inspiration from that pool, so they're not just hoarding it all during their gameplay. So the idea is for them to use it, but they're not getting such a big pile that then they're just spamming the crap out of that, right? Last but not least, again, because I give individual heroic inspiration here, this is something that I let them use on their own. So it's a separate thing from individual heroic inspiration. It doesn't count against their pool of heroic inspiration. So everybody in the party of 5 can have their own individual heroic inspiration, and technically they can have 4 in the pool as well too. It's not going to count against their maximum number of pool of heroic inspiration. Now, if you're familiar with Tales of the Valiant, you probably have heard something or familiar with luck points, which kind of is another alternative way to use inspiration in your D&D game. And the way it works is that if a player misses an attack or fail their saving throw, then they get a luck point. I think they can have up to 5. Then once they get 6, then they have to roll a D4, and they could actually lose luck points at that point. But I believe that the way they work is that they can actually use those luck points and then add it to a roll. So if you have 5 luck points and you roll a D20, then you can actually add those 5 luck points, add 5 to that D20 roll for whatever reason. So it's not something that I wanted to use, because then it becomes a regular thing that you have to keep track of, and I'm trying to avoid constant tracking of things necessarily. So, but I know a lot of people really enjoy that. So if you are interested in learning more about the luck point system, either in addition to or in lieu of the pool of heroic inspiration, I'll put a link in the description below of an article that's written by Mike Shea of Sly Flourish that kind of describes how that works. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the ways that my players can add a token to the pool of heroic inspiration is by using something called heroic failure. Now, this goes back to the idea that I had mentioned before about when someone rolls a natural 1 or a critical failure, there's always a little bit of discrepancy and mixed feelings about if a DM adds like another consequence on top of rolling that one. Some people love it. They think it's great for the story. Other people feel like they've already failed at something, like why add on top of that? And both viewpoints are very valid. So what I had decided to do here is to add something called heroic failure. Now, this is not something, again, that's new to me. It's actually something I've took from other games I played at that I really like what they did here. But the kind of caveat that I made here is that this applies to whenever a player rolls a natural 1, a critical failure, for mostly attack rolls or ability checks, but it kind of depends on the ability check in the situation as well too, or if they failed a saving throw, right? Now, the way I run it is that if they rolled a natural one, then they could just leave it at that and say that it's an automatic miss. No additional consequences are applied. Like they have the option to say like that's all they want. But they also have the option to say that if they do roll a natural one on one of those things, then they can invoke heroic failure, which means that narratively they would have to say what happens to their character that adds on a further consequence to that roll. And that gives them the power to really own up to the narrative and to that consequence to be able to add a token to the pool of heroic inspiration that they can give to their party. And so what does that look like? It can look like a number of different ways. And I have a list here of how some examples that I give players. But again, the biggest thing is that they have to kind of explain narratively how this works, right? So they can't just say like, well, I'm just going to go ahead and like take damage and then just call it a day. You as the DM would work with them on how this looks like in the story that makes sense and make sure that the consequence is significant enough as well too. So if there's like an ability check where, they fail the perception check, but it's a situation where it's like low or even medium stakes, then that wouldn't really make sense in this scenario. But if it was like high stakes, that there was a consequence that comes from it, they can add on to that if they want to invoke adding a token to the pool of heroic inspiration. So some of the examples I have is some of the common ones that you think about is that if they roll a nat 1, then they take the damage of their attack or the spell attack that they tried to use against an enemy. So if they roll the natural 1, then they take the damage, and I put in there without modifiers, so that way it's not so much that they're taking for the damage. If this is a pretty common one for rogues, like if they failed at picking locks, well now maybe they've lost like 75 or 80% of the pick locks because they've fumbled through or didn't realize that they have lost them earlier or something like that. Narratively making that make sense, right? But again, the consequence has to be significant as well too on why that nat 1 justifies having that heroic failure. Maybe a significant item like their shield or their armor or their magic item or a weapon either gets damaged or something happens to it. So now they're either at a disadvantage or they take some sort of penalty from using that armor, or maybe their shield is now broken so they can't use it. So now the AC is down a little bit more. Again, that's a consequence that you as the DM and the player can work with. And then because they take that on themselves as an optional thing, they can add a token of to the pool of heroic inspiration that way. So again, here's a list of all these common things. You can definitely add more, and there's probably other situations where it would make sense to allow that sort of thing to have them invoke heroic failure. So that way, narratively, it makes sense. They take some sort of consequence, whether it's for one round or maybe something that's a little bit more longer term, and then they can add a token to that pool of heroic inspiration that the rest of the party can benefit from. And last but not least, I have included something called a leveling up narrative that allows my players to add a token to the pool of heroic inspiration. And again, this is something that's optional. Not every player, every character has to do this, right? But whenever we see in Dungeons and Dragons that there is an opportunity for a player to level up, depending on your table, sometimes they just level up and they don't really explain like how that happens with their character. So this is another idea that I took from when I played in a D&D game where whenever we leveled up, then we got inspiration for doing that. And so I decided to kind of use this variation for encouraging my players to add a token to the pool of heroic inspiration. The idea here is that they explain in detail and something that makes narrative sense on how their character levels up in their class that they're leveling up in, right? So like for Barbarian, second level, they get reckless attack. A lot of times just like, oh, well, I just attack without, thinking about it basically, right? Narratively, that makes sense, but it's not really in depth. So what I try to do is I try to work with the players on what happened previously that allows them to kind of take on that new ability or that new feature in their class when they level up here, right? And I know that I believe it's Xanathar's Guide to Everything that gives a kind of like a variant thing of how you can have your players kind of work or earn leveling up in a sense by like spending some gold and spending some time to doing that. That doesn't work for every game because sometimes time is of the essence, or they don't have a week to do that sort of thing, and you don't want to like hold that leveling up option behind a wall like that necessarily, but you can encourage them to think about how their character levels up and how they get this brand new ability that they didn't have before by thinking narratively and sharing with the rest of the group, like how their character is able to do that thing that they weren't able to do before either. And so that's something that, again, optional. Not every player has to do that, and you might not have every player do that, and so that allows the pool to kind of fill up quickly if you do have every player to take the option of doing a leveling up narrative. But again, it being optional, it being fun for you and for the player to kind of think about how this makes sense for their character, and just kind of give them a chance to either role play or just add to the story if they really enjoyed that part of the game. So those are the 3 things I've added to my games I want to share with you all. I have other house rules and other things that I've adapted into my games, but those are the things that I wanted to share with you that I think you could probably benefit from. So definitely let me know if you like this idea, if there's something that you would change, or if maybe you notice something that I haven't noticed yet in terms of what could be problematic or something to think about when using these rules and all that. So definitely feel free to leave a comment and let me know, and let's have a conversation about that. Thank you.